Yo, what is up guys? It is ABOP, and in today's video, I'm going to be getting into some pretty deep details on the weapon balancing. At the very minimum, I really hope that you guys at least learn about why some of these weapons feel the way they do, whether they feel overwhelming or underwhelming to you. Hopefully we can understand how those relationships and interactions work a bit more. One thing I will say before we get started, I am a firm believer that some of the best solutions and suggestions come from disagreement. So don't feel bad about roasting me or giving some strong constructive criticism. I mean, you can make a reaction video just saying ABOP's trash and terrible suggestions. Hopefully as a community, if we really start digging deep into what we think are problems, maybe we can find some solutions. I actually think Embark does listen, but I also think that it's up to the community to make sure we're giving quality suggestions so that they don't eventually start ignoring us because we're trash at suggestions or something. I'm going to give a real quick shout out to Oppo, Mr. Zafferman, and Mr. It's Now, because they are the ones that made it easy for me to get access to this data. Oppo provided a Discord that he puts these spreadsheets in, and It's Now and Zafferman are the ones that made these spreadsheets that I collected the data from. So thank you. While I will mostly be talking about ways that we can buff weapons, I think that it is extremely important to talk about nerfs also, mainly because I feel like sometimes the nerfs were deserved, but a lot of the times they were in the wrong direction or doing things to weapons that made them feel not as fun when they could have done something else. It'll make a lot more sense when I get into the details. Now, the very first thing I'm going to talk about is something that I believe is very important to get right. That is something I'm going to call the Big Six, and that's going to be the M11, the XP54, the AKM, the FCAR, the M60, and the Lewis. These are the original 6 fully automatic weapons that were implemented into the game. They are probably going to be the most versatile weapons throughout the life cycle of the game, and they're probably going to have the most cosmetics. And in general, I think it's pretty safe to have the highest pick rates on these weapons. I think that's okay. But with that being said, these are going to be the weapons that a lot of new players and players coming to try out the game are going to pick up first. If someone picks up one of these weapons and it does not feel good, they can easily write this game off as having bad gunplay when really they're just using a bad weapon and never get the opportunity to become true the finals enjoyers. My goal with these changes is to not only make the weapons a bit more easier, consistent, and easier to understand as a whole, as in their relationship with not only their class, but other weapons in their class. And that way everybody has a better understanding of how just weapons should perform. And that can also help people like content creators, professional players, even maybe the developers themselves have a more thorough understanding of what, again, is supposed to be a good weapon in the first place. With that being said, I will be providing numbers for my suggestions. That's because it'll be much easier to show you exactly what I'm talking about. But I am mainly going to be focusing on things like the relationship of the weapons to each other. I'm not going to be really worried about actual pure DPS and TTK because that is something that I am not sure about. I don't know if they want the TTK to be faster or slower. And again, if they had at least a few set weapons that they were hard focused on how they performed, maybe we as a community, and again, them as developers, can have a baseline, a gold standard. Now let's start talking about some of these patterns. One of the first patterns that a lot of you guys may have noticed is that light leans more towards a higher DPS and higher burst damage, while heavy makes up for it in sustained damage, which can still equate to some pretty solid DPS, especially when it's constantly being put down. This relationship even holds true in things like the grenade launcher. For example, the heavy has a 6-barrel reloadable grenade launcher that is just spamming out grenades. The medium has a grenade launcher, but it's a little slower. You have to manually load one round in at a time. And if light had one, I would assume that it would be something like the thermal bore where you put one in, boom, one in, Boom. You can even look at shotguns. You have the SA-12, which is fully automatic. It just boom, 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 and it just keeps putting things down. Even has a decent reload speed. You get to the model, which, you know, it puts it down kind of at a moderate rate, and it does have a bit of a weird reload to slow it down quite a bit, actually. And then when you get to light, again, you're heading more into this burst damage, and it is just a little boom, boom, double barrel shotgun. Another thing that I have noticed is when things start to fall out of this rule set or pattern, you start to notice weapons that are much harder to balance than others. For example, knives lean more into sustained damage, which is the opposite of their class because they're just non-stop going, and they've been a nightmare to balance. And on the flip side, you've seen KS-23, which is kind of leaning towards burst. I mean, shotguns in general are, which is why SA-12 is also hard to balance. Now, getting back to the big six, I'm going to talk about something called Gen 1 weapons and Gen 2 weapons. The Gen 1 weapons are the M11, the AKM, and the M60. And for those of you that don't know, those were the first weapons out in the game. And then the Gen 2 weapons came along, and that's the XP54, the FCAR, and the Lewis. If you guys haven't noticed, there's actually quite a few relationships that are consistent between the Gen 1 and Gen 2 weapons. For example, all of the Gen 1 weapons typically have larger magazines, higher rates of fire. They're typically more close range weapons, while the Gen 2 weapons extend at longer ranges. And even optics. When the FCAR and the XP54 received an optic, they didn't have one at first. I was surprised when the Lewis didn't get one. Let's start talking about some inconsistencies between these classes. And while I do think it's important to bring these up, and I do want to talk about how looking at them to see where we can start guiding these weapons if troubles do occur, I also want to state that I don't want to remove too much uniqueness from these weapons. But even if we just happen to do so, I think it will still leave plenty of room for future weapons to be implemented into the game. For example, you can possibly have something similar to pre-nerf FCAR, pre-nerf Lewis, but balanced in a different way to make it a bit more fair. Maybe there's a gun that comes out that has the DPS as old Lewis, but it has a much lower fire rate. Maybe it has a weird mechanic to it to kind of reel it in, a smaller magazine to kind of reel it in and make it balanced that way. But we need a gold standard. To simplify how this chart works, it's simply asking the question, is Gen 1 better than Gen 2 at doing X or whatever you see on the left-hand side? Now let's quickly fly through this chart because I will go over a bit more later. M11 does have more damage than XP54 up close. AKM technically has more damage than FCAR, although I'm not a fan of that relationship. I'll talk about that more. M60 loses to Lewis. Range, this is lose, lose, lose. RPM, this is a win-win-win. Recoil is a bit weird, so it's lose, win, win for now. But one thing that I want to talk about is that they used to be a lot more consistent. I don't know if you guys remember, but XP54, FCAR, and Lewis even at one point all pulled up into the right, and Lewis eventually did go kind of crazy, but for the most part it was pretty vertical. And then the M60, AKM, and M11 were the ones that had this more zigzaggy pattern going on. But magazine size, again, for Gen 1, they win-win-win. Reload is win, lose, and I think tie. Hip fire is win, and AKM deceptively comes off as better, but I think FCAR is better. I think the reason why AKM and M60 feels better sometimes is because of their fire rates. You're getting more ding, 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 but I think that FCAR and Lewis are better, at least when I looked at the actual circles on my screen for testing. Now I'm going to show you guys two charts, and after these charts, that's when I will get into the combat advantage charts, and that's when I'll start giving actual numbers and suggestions for the weapons. So this right here is the DPS charts of the big six, and I just wanted to really point out the Lewis. The Lewis extends past both assault rifles and really severely gaps the M60, and it's just something that I'm curious about, like what are their intended DPSs and ranges. Personally, what I think would be a bit healthier is, again, adding a gun to the game later that can kind of do stuff like that, where it kind of pushes these limits and start becoming a little more outliers. I don't think it's healthy to have a versatile weapon that sticks out this much. And I think that's why they keep adjusting the recoil so much and making it worse and worse and worse. Sorry for the rant. Now in this next chart, this is the classes averaged out for the big six. So it's just the two weapons, but you have light, medium, and heavy. And you will notice that there is a bit of an outlier when it comes to the light class. Now, I think that's fine, but I think that should be monitored closely. And I think that Embark should be pretty careful, because what I think can easily happen is that if you're pushing this glass cannon roll, if you're pushing that DPS, you can make the casual experience a nightmare. And it's not even going to do that much for the competitive play, the higher level play. As soon as you get light to a point where they're doing enough damage to actually truly be viable with the current utility that they have, I think it will damage casual pretty heavily. I think the problem with light is more of their utility and some of their roles, but that is something that I might talk about in another video. I do want to do a video like this, but with gadgets. So if you guys like this video, of course, leave a like and subscribe. If it does, even okay, I will make that gadget video, or I want to make that gadget video. All right, now let's get into the good stuff. I am finally going to be talking about M11 versus XP54. I'm glad we're talking about this one first, because in my opinion, this is the healthiest relationship. And I like that M11 really feels like a close range weapon. It really feels like it has a role, and XP54 does kind of push out in these ranges, but it doesn't have that good of a hip fire, has a bit of a longer reload. Like, it really is a bit different. I personally think that the M11 could use a bit of love though. What I would do to the M11 is pretty simple. I would significantly reduce the recoil, make it a little worse than what the AKM is. And from there, I would monitor it if I was a developer. I don't think it would be super busted, at least looking at how the damage looks here on paper. Now, what I will say is that if it does need a nerf, I would rather it feel good. Again, have a little bit of versatility, not so much kicking around. And if it does need a nerf, going back to those damage types, if we lean more towards burst instead of sustained, maybe we can increase the rate of fire, but reduce the damage per bullet. So we're keeping the DPS the same, but we're punishing people a little more for missing their shots, but those shots are easier to get also. So it's a bit of a trade-off. I feel like that would be the healthier route to go, but overall, I think this looks pretty good. Now, the XP54 is a whole video on its own. I am going to contradict myself a little bit. I think that the XP54 is as close as it gets right now to being like a gold standard, truly optimized weapon that feels like what I think the final should feel like. But I also believe that it's a little too versatile right now. But that versatility is also what makes it feel so good. So what I would try to do is help exaggerate some of the weaknesses without reducing how it feels. So it may technically be less versatile, but it won't feel less versatile. I know that's weird, but when I get into the numbers, it'll make a bit more sense. Now let's start talking about the XP54 versus AKM real quick, so I can help explain why the XP54 feels like a problem for a lot of people. Now, the way that this chart works is it's showing that right here at the -25 mark, it is saying that the XP54 has a -25% advantage over AKM at 0 meters, for example. And what that means is that the AKM user will eliminate the XP54 user 25% faster. I know that's a little complicated, but just know that red means the situation's worse for you and green means the situation's better for you. So what I would say is that I do feel like that the relationship starts out pretty fair. You got your little light user going against an AKM. If you're hitting all your shots with the AKM, you should be able to eliminate your light. Now, the problem occurs, in my opinion, is when you start to get around this 30-meter mark and the XP54 really starts to catch back up. The XP54 gets to a point where it's almost a 2.6% disadvantage, which really isn't a disadvantage once you take into consideration things like size of the light class, maneuverability of the light class, and the chances of them getting a drop on you. And with good recoil control, that means they're just getting pretty much free fights for the most part at that range. Now, this doesn't happen as much in the higher elos, at least from my experiences, but I can definitely see this being a problem in casual gameplay. And overall, I don't think that it's good representation of how the weapon should feel if you have an SMG that's performing like an assault rifle at ranges, or what feels like better because of the recoil. But again, it's a bit of a dilemma, because if you eliminate the recoil to try to reduce the range of the SMGs, it's just not as fun of a weapon. So here's my suggestion. So my suggestion would be something called a 2-stage damage reduction. And this is what this new relationship looks like. Now, this does need work, definitely. I just literally threw some numbers in. The first numbers I came up with were the first ones I threw in. And overall, it is a bit of a nerf to the XP. So that could be worked with too, to kind of bring it back up. But I think having actually every SMG have this 2-stage damage drop off implemented into the weapon could be pretty healthy for the game, so you can keep SMGs having very low recoil. I don't know how complicated it is to implement that. I don't know how bad it could interact with maybe some other things in the game. I don't know. Again, I'm not a developer. I can't test this stuff, but if I was a developer, I would love to at least test this out and see how it works out, because in my opinion, this just looks a bit healthier than this. Although again, it's a little overdone. I definitely think those numbers could be worked out, but very quickly, I will show you the before and after. This is the original damage drop off. And as you see, this first drop is pretty aggressive on the 2-stage version. I don't think it should be that aggressive, but I do want to see, like, once you get past whatever Embark determines is out of range for SMGs, you get an aggressive drop off, and it just gets to a point where you're just out of range. I mean, you can pepper up the target, maybe provide some supportive fire, but it's no longer an assault rifle. Now, again, please note, I know this sounds like a fat nerf. Again, I don't control the game. And again, even if I did, I don't think damage is that much of a problem when it comes to the light class. I think the biggest problem by far is their utility. I can go on and on about what could be done to help light, but let's continue. Now let's talk about the AKM and the FCAR relationship. And to make a long story short, I think that they just feel way too similar, which makes it kind of boring in my opinion. I feel like I just run whatever weapon that I have a cosmetic for that matches my fit. Like, that's really what it comes down to for me. I am pretty used to the FCAR recoil, so really these do just feel like the same gun to me. So some of the recommended changes that I would make is +1 damage to the AKM and a very slight range reduction. So instead of retaining 55% damage, it only retains 50, and maybe have the damage drop off start a little sooner, but that also comes with a hip fire buff. So really make it a CQB weapon and have its advantages. It would still be a perfectly viable mid-range weapon. Like, the nerfs aren't necessary. I am only putting them into my calculations and my charts to kind of show what I think is a healthy relationship and what would make someone pick one weapon over the other. Now, when we get into the car, again, I want this thing to be a laser. XP54, laser, FCAR, laser, Lewis, laser, and a bit more focused on range. And even if the FCAR, again, if it feels overtuned, maybe we could start with nerfing the hip fire to reduce its versatility and go from there. I mean, there's 1,000 things you can do to the weapons, but this looks very healthy to me. This looks like I now have 2 weapons to pick from. Which one's actually going to be better for the map I'm playing, for my playstyle, and so on. Now here we have M60 over Lewis, and again, put yourself in the shoes as an M60 loser. Yeah, M60 loser is probably pretty accurate, because as you can see, at every range, every distance, every situation, you are getting outgunned by the M60 up to a 60% disadvantage. That is pretty significant, but what I would do to help make them a healthy relationship, to actually make the M60 viable, and hopefully the Lewis viable too. I mean, the Lewis is definitely having its problems right now. Again, kind of a pattern here, a significant reduction to recoil to the Lewis, give the M60 just 1 damage, and oh yeah, you guys aren't gonna like this. Reduce the Lewis's engagement range, so when the damage drop off starts and when the damage drop off ends, by 5 meters, and instead of retaining 67% damage, it retains 50% damage. And while that does sound scary, while that sounds like a fat nerf, the crazy thing is it still pretty much destroys Lewis M60. But again, if you gave the M60 tight hip fire and you reduced the Lewis's hip fire and the Lewis recoil is laser, I actually think this could work. I actually think this could be pretty healthy. And if we want something later in the game, I think I said it a few times now, if we want like a slow rate of fire, low magazine weapon that has DPS and range like this, like the Lewis, I think that could work. But having just such a versatile weapon, just with those type of stats, in my opinion, it's a bit much. A lot of people are going to disagree because they like Lewis and they just like shredding everything in their way. But I would rather it be a little easier to use, but also a bit more realistic or fair, at least in terms of balance. And that's an opinion. Hey, but you can look at the paper. It's insane. So here are the 3 previous relationships. And now here are the 3 new relationships. Again, just put yourself in the shoes of someone that's kind of picking a weapon, that's trying to decide on which weapon to use. If it was pretty clear that one weapon is a bit more CQB oriented, but then the other one was a bit more aim and range focused, which one would you gravitate to? Would it be easier to figure out which weapon to pick and like? And would you be switching between weapons more? And this is just honestly just a genuine question. Like, it's not like, again, I don't really care if you just completely hate my suggestions. What I do care about is that you actually give some feedback if you do, so I can at least know why. I just genuinely want to know why. I'm that type of person. I like to dig deep on situations like this. It's pretty fascinating to me. But that will be it for this video. I am really happy to be back at YouTube again. Thank you.